Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Chilling Reign, and very soon the stuff from Evolving Skies, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, we are going to be talking about the Champions Cube. You may have seen the draft and my pre-draft tactics, but I'm going to give you a quick rundown of how the tournament went. It took place over this weekend. It was a Delta Eevee's cube. We can go ahead and check the full list out on Cube Koga. Things to note is that there were mutant evolution rules going on with Delta species Pokemon thanks to some of these custom cards that were added into the cube. There's a tool, a stadium, an A-Spec, and a regular trainer version that allowed you to branch off your Delta Pokemon, of which there were different types. Well, in every single line of the cube, there were also a couple of Delta, like basics and stage 1s. So essentially every archetype had the chance to become Delta evolution Pokemon and could mutant branch their way off into different avenues that were specifically put into the cube to make them stronger. So it was a 5-round of Swiss. Then there was a round for those that were on the bubble to make sure we had a clean top 8 cut. And then it was singular limb top 8. So yeah, let's jump straight into it. The deck that I ended up drafting, you can go back and watch how I drafted this deck, was actually going to be a big basic metal deck. I felt like metals had a really good chance here. I often like to draft big basic archetypes if I believe they are possible within cubes, because I think the value of drafting basics comes with there's a lot of strengths here. Because typically you need to draw less combo pieces throughout the entire game. You just need to find your basic and then turn attach every single turn to get online. In this instance, they had high enough hit points, and the reduction of special metal energy essentially made them the sort of bulkiness of stage 2s. And although their damage cap wasn't quite as high as some of the stage 2 Pokemon, in general, it allowed me to set up 2 shots. So I lent into this tanking approach with the special metals by also having the Heal Dance Gardevoir as a 1/1/1 line in the list. I drafted this pretty early on, and if you go back and watch the draft, I had 2 different directions that I was thinking about here. I was either going to try and increase my damage output by having Ampharos as a backup stage 2, or I was going to go Gardevoir for a defensive approach. There was a point at which I built this 60 with a 1/1/1 line of both of the stage 2s. I ended up taking out the Ampharos, and just kept the 1/1/1 Guardy. On reflection, I feel like that was an okay choice. I feel like possibly I would have had a better chance in some of the rounds had I had more options than just my metal attackers in general, but we'll get into that in the rundown momentarily. Overall, I think the list is pretty clean. I'm very happy with the amount of decent starter Pokemon that I had. With Wishing Star Jirachi, with Chatot, and with Ocean Search Manaphy. These were all very strong. I didn't have much Bull Search. Swoop Teleporter could get me into one of those good opening basics quite nicely, and meant that I could replace Shaman EX and Jirachi EX into one prize Pokemon much easier. But yeah, that one Ultra Ball was pretty decent. Obviously, we had Collector and we had Holland Mentor alongside the double Transceiver to get our basics into play early, and essentially the backup Porygon 2 just became that fallback engine for me to maintain a good steady amount of cards throughout the game, despite having, not the highest value supporters around. I think some of the best ones were the likes of Oracle, Marnie, Tantalizer is just decent in general as well. But yeah, you can see I had Palpad and Versaseeker also, as well as the Celebi EX that allows me to put a card back on top of my deck when it comes into play. These sorts of cards allowed me to reload the likes of Koga's Trap for extra damage mod and Confusion, which is great for a 2-hit KO style deck, or Marnie just for hand disrupting other people that didn't necessarily have Porygon 2 developed. So I was kind of like a beat down aggro deck, but at the same time, I could last into the long game because I had special metals and this tanking approach on my side. So it's a fairly low power cube in general. A lot of the stage 2s are hitting around that sort of 70 mark. So oftentimes I was tanking hits, undoing damage, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's really the approach I went for. I didn't quite get like the best metal Pokemon. I think the Heatran and the Dialga are some of the strongest ones. But I would have really liked, there was a Lucario EX that I could have got. But overall, pretty happy with where we ended up, to be honest. And I think there were a couple of broken cards in here. I think Parallel City is a very, very strong card in a low power cube. When Pokemon are hitting around that sort of 50 to 70 mark, when I can undo 20 of that damage from water, fire, and grass types, that's ridiculous value. And it obviously stacked alongside the metal energies. So yeah, crazy overall. But here's some shoulda, woulda, couldas about the list. I think my biggest downside was that I had pretty much just metal Pokemon to attack with. I didn't have any other colored energy in the deck, so I couldn't even like attempt to attack with any of my other Pokemon. They were just there for setup. And as good as my Pokemon were, Heatran was my highest damage output type Pokemon, and that was based on coin flips, so I could never guarantee KOs when I really like needed them. I had to rely on coin flips to get myself over the line and overcommit energies all onto one Pokemon, which came with its downsides, either if I like flipped multiple tails, or even if my opponent got an unlikely response KO after I was able to take a big heavy metal knockout. So those things were a bit awkward, and there was a lack of tool removal because there are 3 cessation crystals in the cube, and me not having an answer to re-enable my powers could slow me down a lot of instances. I think the main issue was the monotype attacking, and going back to that option of me having a 1/1/1 Ampharos, even if I just played 1 Lightning Energy and a 1/1/1 Ampharos, I would have had a better attacking option into other Lightning Pokemon, because there are a number of Lightning Pokemon that actually had a -30 resistance, which is actually a big issue. Again, it's like I was saying with Parallel, when you have a natural -30 on your damage output, when my damage isn't already that high, it's a bit of an issue. But what I will say is, being a monotype attacking deck wasn't a problem in terms of the weakness map, because I already had a weak guard energy, I had Guzhala to search it out, I had Celebi EX that could recover weakness guard energy if I needed to, and Heatran is weak to water, whereas Dialgas are weak to fire, so I could play around the type coverage game that little bit. So I think it was mostly the resistance that was holding me back more than anything else. If you want to check out any of the gameplay, you can go over to the P3 podcast on Twitch. They streamed the entire drafting process and every single round of the cube itself was recorded as well. So I got on there for one of the rounds. I believe it was my top 8 game. So you can watch that as well if you'd like. But yeah, we'll get to that momentarily. So spoilers, I told you that I made top 8 at least. But anyways, in round 1, we came up against Zach Kreckler, obviously a fantastic player, and he was able to draft Kingdra Eevees. Now, Kingdra is one of the highest priority stage 2 picks in the draft because it's a 1 energy, potential to do 60 and a 20 damage spread. That's just super efficient, easy to use, a 130 hit point, 1 prize Pokemon, as well as really on that high end. So Kingdra is a priority card. You'll see it pop up in a few other lists, and he's tried to use Vaporeons and Leafeons alongside that for the most part. Now, his biggest issue here is that he has no stadium removal, and I played Parallel, so I really punished the lack of damage output that he was doing. I was able to establish Gardevoir, get that online alongside Parallel, alongside Special Metals. Effectively, he was doing 0 damage a turn, and I was just able to churn through him. So some pretty fast concessions as soon as I got Parallel developed in both games, so a swift 2-0 there. In at round 2, we came up against PG Pichu's Ampharos list. And this is a much harder matchup, right? Because the Ampharos EX up here has a -30 resist. The other Ampharoses have a -20 resist. All of them are punishing me for doing certain actions, like jamming is putting damage all across my board for playing supporter cards, which is pretty necessary. You can't really play around that too much. And Conductivity punishes you for attaching energy cards. Less so important, but still relevant, is that if I'm evolving, I'm taking damage on certain things, which obviously put things like Porygon 2 and Gardevoir into range of certain attacks, because there are spreading options of Cluster Bolt and stuff like that. So, yeah, much harder matchup. We ended up tying this just because we both basically developed brick walls against each other. The natural resistance on all the Ampharoses and the fact that I only had 2 custom catchers meant that he was able to just like tank hits, retreat, move around, and sort of just like waste time with all of his energy removal style options. And I had so much reduction in my list as well, and the healing from Gardevoir meant that we were both just having a pillow fight essentially. And even though we had 90-minute rounds to finish a best of 3, we ended up 1-1, and after 3 turns of time, after 90 minutes, we still couldn't conclude a winner. I think we both had 5 prizes remaining in that 3rd game, so we ended up tying there. Basically, neither of us could do meaningful damage into one another to actually get the job done there. But that really highlighted that I really needed a way to attack with things that didn't just have resistance. And this is kind of where I go back to me possibly having a 1/1/1 Amphi line. I was concerned about just not having enough damage in general, and Conductivity certainly would have helped that because all of these Amphis have 3 energy attack costs, but also I just wouldn't have been dealing with resistance. I would have been able to Gigavolt straight back into him. My ideal scenario would have been drafting a Pseudo Wudo for Watch and Learn, because obviously then I hit for weakness, and it's a 2 energy basic, and it's easy to weave into the deck just with like an Aurora energy or something like that, or just again with 1 fighting energy because I have Versus Seeker, Clara, Palpad, Ornery Rod, and Dialga. I had plenty of ways to loop one energy attachment and one Pokemon. I would have been plain sailing, but the Sudowoodo came in our draft packs very, very early before I even knew that I was going on to metals. So I didn't really ever have the chance to actually weave in Sudowoodo, despite me like touting it early on as a good card to have. But yeah, in the end, we ended up having a very long, arduous tie against PG Pichu. In at round 3, we face Tomas, who's playing Sceptile with that Kingdra. As you can see, Kingdra is just a good enough card to play a 1/1/1 line in your deck. And yeah, the same issue here for Tomas was that I was able to develop Parallel. And because I have Celebi EX, I can just like reload the Parallel to make sure that that's the last stadium that sticks into play. And then all of his damage output is kind of crummy. Able to take a win off me by just going over the top with a Leaf Blade that got out of control. Early Sceptile pressure, essentially, that just took a knockout early. But outside of that, we were pretty okay. We were able to just build our Heatran with all the energies and get the job done in that instance. In round 4, we faced Blue Cheesecake's Eevee Box deck. And Eevee Box is like obviously a big part of the cube. The namesake of the cube is Delta Eevees. We all received 2 of the Delta Eevees at the start of the cube for free alongside Weak Guard Energy. So I think in general, it's obviously a direction that the builder has tried to offer up to everyone. There are a lot of interesting evolutions, as you can see pictured. Vaporeon is just a very high tempo style card that has spread options, and the Umbreon is kind of like that big payoff card attacker when you get multiple stage 1 set up. Evo Blast is doing very, very respectable damage, some of the highest damage output in the entire draft, and it has the option to pick itself up on a coin flip to undo damage. As long as you keep ahead in attachments, you can use this every now and then to just buy a turn back, essentially. So yeah, this is a very scary card, but fortunately, with the Vaporeons doing a lot of the heavy lifting in Blue Cheesecake's list, I was able to undo a lot of that damage again with Parallel and all that other good stuff. And I got fairly fortunate in coin flips in this round with my Heatran. And when Heatran just flips too many heads, you just wipe out big threats. And I was able to wipe out the Umbreon, I think, for a 3-prize knockout because it even had an expert belt on. And when that happens, you just fly ahead in the prize race and you wipe like their best attacker off the board. A lot of energy. There's no energy acceleration going on in this list. And when the Vaporeon can't do any of that sort of heavy lifting with a low energy attack cost, it meant that I was able to sort of cruise through there. Admittedly, some flips went favorably for me, which meant the game sort of ended quickly. But ultimately, we got over the line there. In at round 5, so I'm sat at 301 here. So even if I lose, I'm not on the bubble. I would make cuts regardless. But it meant that we could have a pretty chilled out game against Al, who is playing Gardevoir. I have natural resistance with my metal types here, so I'm at a bit of an advantage. Al's able to take 1 game off of me, where he's able to build Energy Burst up to a sizable amount with a Cess Crystal, so I can't like draw my way out of the hole, and Energy Burst is just like plowing through me essentially, which is very, very strong. Also, the Black Magic Gardevoir, the Delta Gardevoir, is a very, very strong card. Even with my bench reduction mechanics from Stump and Parallel, it was still doing extremely respectable damage. So a difficult card to play around in general, but in a couple other games, Al had slower starts. He prized Curliers in a couple of his games as well, and we were just able to capitalize on that. We are big basic early aggro. All those dumb things happened. Al had a really cool win against me, though, where he was using Future Sight on Ralts to slow me down, and then he was just trying to use things like Skull Grunt, Yellow Grunt, Wondrous Labyrinth, these sorts of cards just to lock me up for like 5 turns, basically. And he was able to build his base from there just by like attaching energies, using telekinesis on Curlier to snipe things. So that was really fun to watch. A bit scary, obviously. He even got a double head Cyrus Initiative that took me out of Ultra Ball, which would have been into a Porygon 2, and took me out of Transceiver, which would have at least got me 3 cards. So yeah, that was pretty gross to deal with. I scooped as soon as that happened. But that was the only loss. We were able to win 2-1. So into top 8, I'm top seed at 401. Slight also, well, not also, he was on a 4-1 record. Because he was the first seed, he had 2 buys, so really he was like 2-1. So he was still unsure about how good his deck was, which is quite a funny thing to hear. Al, obviously, with a very strong deck, me being his only loss. And then we see there is also 2 other 4/1s, Williazar with Delta Eevees, Blue Cheesecake with that Delta Eevees as well. The only loss again was to myself. And there's a 3/1/1 in Lewis, who was also playing Eevees. So you can see it was definitely a popular archetype. And as I said, there was a round here where I was just sitting out for a bit because we had to decide of the 3/2s who was going to win out in some best of one games. And it was actually Vic and Odysseus who won their bubble best of ones, effectively making them 4-2 records, so that they were seeded 8th and 7th. So you could see that I was up against Odysseus, who was playing, again, Eevee box. There's going to be a theme here. Lots of the Eevees made top 8s. They seem to be versatile archetypes where they have different type coverages that they can boast, so that's never an issue for them. And in general, things like the Umbreon Prime is very strong. The regular Umbreon giving free retreat. The Espeon that actually buffs hit points, which Odysseus wasn't able to draft, was really one of the main reasons why we were able to win this series, is that he just had a lot of 2-prize Pokemon that just didn't have enough hit points to cope with the likes of aggressive Heatran, the likes of just 2-shotting with my Dialga G, because 50 into 70 is such good numbers here, even when they're using things like Expert Belt. So I was just able to keep ahead on the attachment game in our first round, and in the second game. We had some favorable coin flips, and it's one of those things where it's kind of awkward to attribute lots of heads to being a win condition, but ultimately Heatran just gets out of control if he's not pressurized early enough, and that's something that Odysseus wasn't able to do. So we were able to take the win there. I also think that he had some awkward Poker Drawer so he was able to use double Poker Drawer in one of the rounds, and he wasn't able to get like his ideal turn, which was due to prizing. I think he either prized the Prime or he prized a DCE, something like that, and wasn't able to achieve like a big knockout, and that gave me a really good like foothold in the game. He had to go for Vaporeon instead and like take out a benched Porygon 2, which admittedly was strong, but it wasn't taking out like all of my energy, which this double Poker Drawer play had the potential to do. So that was a bit of a let-off due to prizes in one of our rounds. But regardless, I feel like my matchup was pretty solid here. Just because his deck is based on like bench synergy for making the Evo Blast a powerful effect, and we have so much good bench control in general, and he doesn't have that higher hit points, even with the 1 Expert Belt. He's using the Primes, which are treated as 2-prize Pokemon in this draft. So yeah. So then we go into top 4, and we're up against another Eevee box. This one is a lot scarier than the ones that we have faced before. The reason being, it is much more heavily focused on Jolteon rather than the likes of Espeon and Umbreon. Because these Jolteons, similar to the Amphiroses, have lots of resistance. Both the Jolteon EX and the Delta Jolteon have a -30, which means my damage output is pitiful, and it means that I'm overcommitting energy attachments for then his Flareon to come in, an Evolving Flare KO me. He was able to get the Evolving Flare out of nowhere in a few combinations, the likes of double Rainbow Energy, and the likes of just using Gardevoir to energy jump one off of his other Pokemon and turn attach. So yeah, a very, very horrible matchup. I think in both games as well, they got set up quite quickly. They had Mentor turn 1 both games, Fearow turn 2, at least in one of the games. It may have been both. So they really got off the mark quickly, putting a lot of pressure into play, going ahead in the race very aggressively. And because my attacks are doing such pitiful damage and I only have 2 customs to try and work things out to sort of deal with the option of Flareon and that sort of stuff, they have Umbreon EX for gusting. Meant that I just couldn't really get a foothold. I couldn't grow any attacker in the bench realistically. They were able to pick things off, and I'll be honest, it wasn't a close series. The first game I basically had Dialga and just attached, and got knocked out over a couple of turns. That was after I had my Gentleman's Mulligan from a like unworkable hand, and we go into another unworkable hand essentially. And then game 2, he just gets his optimal setup way too quickly, and the Jolteons just have way too much time to sort of develop and get too many energies into play, and then it's just sloshing around with all sorts of attackers. Like the Gardevoir has a really high damage cap. I wasn't able to find my parallel or my stump early enough, so Black Magic was threatening like 100 damage, and that's just way too much for my deck to deal with. Which meant it was actually a Eevee box in the mirror, so we lost in top 4. So you just seen the list on the left was Williazar's, and on the right it was Lewis's list. who is playing a heavily focused Flareon-based build, so I would have lost into the final even if I got there, for sure, because those Espeons buffing the hit points on Flareons would have just been, like, hideous for me to deal with. But it was actually Williazza who was able to come out on top. I do believe, just based on paper, that their list is probably stronger, although Espeon is really good for, increasing your hit points. Both players are playing it. And I think, in general, the Porygon 2, the consistency side that Lewis has, is kind of offset by the aggression that Umbreon EX poses, that Feraligatr dragging things off the bench offers, and the Gardevoir offers. So that mutant element of his list just outclassed the pure evolution approach in the end. But that's not to say that it wasn't a close series. It was a really long series, a best of 3, no less. And it was actually a really interesting one to watch in the end. So I do encourage you guys to go and watch it back. It is a long one, but it's certainly tactical, and there's a lot going on, especially in those last few turns where they're both walking on eggshells, not playing into the opponent's either power hand extension or black belts. Those are 2 key cards to keep an eye out on. So that wraps things up. We ended up in top 4. Honestly, my games weren't super interesting. There was a few rounds where I just locked in parallel and could yawn through games, and that's just not a great thing to have. And then there were games where I just lost to resistance outright. So that's down to my own deck building and not being creative enough to weave in other attacking lines. So that's certainly something I need to go in thinking about in the future. I actually did earmark some of the fighting basics. As I said earlier, the Sudowoodo would have been the highlight. Also, I attempted to wheel a Regirock, because I opened up a pack that had Regirock in, but I took another powerful card instead, thinking that the pack was strong enough for me to wheel a Regirock, which didn't actually happen. And looking back, maybe I had to prioritize that Regirock enough that it was just a too important card to play. At the same time, the Regirock would have forced me to play multiple fighting energies, and maybe I would have just got a lot more clunky, would have got a lot less mileage out of my Heatran, which was an all-star for me because I was a pure metal deck. So hindsight's one of those things. In general, I feel like the remaining few decks in the tournament probably would have beaten me regardless. So I think top 4 is pretty much the fairest place to put my deck anyway. But my final thoughts on the cube itself. Toolbox sounded just nuts. You play so many type coverages. You can bully a lot of these stage 2 decks just because you come out swinging early with, one of your, 3 evolution type coverages or whatever, and you just start putting a lot of pressure on them. Especially with that Espeon that buffs hit points, the Umbreon that gives you free retreat. You just have so much flexibility with your guys that you can put a lot of tempo out on people quite consistently. So they just seem like very, very good in general. I think that should in general be the meta. You should always be weaving in Eevees, even if you're playing stage 1 and 2 Pokemon. I do love the Delta Mutant element that's been crafted into this cube, and it does make it super interesting for good deck building, but not so much that it's completely based around this. Like, there were plenty of lists that were just ignoring the fact that there was Delta evolution going on, but there were some of them that used it to great effect, for example, the winning list. And overall, I think, outside of a couple of key cards, this cube is very, very close to perfectly balanced. I think it's one of the most fun cubes I've had to play recently. Even though my rounds themselves weren't super fun, it's been a great cube to think about. And I do think from the other games that I've watched so far from the stream, they were very tactical, they were skill intensive, it's rewarded good deck building and good gameplay overall. So down at the bottom are some of the most questionable cards in the cube. I know Sceptile didn't do all that well in the end, but I am very concerned about that card. Porygon 2, just because there's only a few people who could ever draft them, and they always end up being in the lists of the people ending in the highest positions because it just gets you so much value throughout the entire game. Parallel, like I said, just punishes 3 different type coverages and limits bench, and that's just way too much power for one deck to hold, essentially. Kingdra is efficient enough to play 1/1/1 lines no matter what deck you're playing. If you have 1 water, 1 rainbow, that's enough justification to play Kingdra. Similar thing for Guardi, it was the main selling point of going either Gardevoir or going Delta-based, because then you get to have that awesome power and 2 amazing attacks. If people attack into this Gardevoir, it becomes a sniping Pokemon, and Black Magic is the highest damage output in the cube, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, those are the cards that I think are on the sus list, and I have a personal hatred to Cess Crystal because I think it's just really awkward that you can give the best attackers in the game the chance to also turn them into Garbodor. So I think that in general is just such a sad thing to do, and I'm not too happy about it because people can control when to turn the tool on and off by just retreating, doing their own abilities, going back into the active, that sort of thing. So yeah, overall I think Cess Crystal is just not a fun card for cube, especially at low power. where you can just get stuck out of all of your options very, very often. So yeah, that really wraps things up. That is the Champs Cube. Let's go back to my list that last time. I thought I had it on the last slide, but I didn't. Overall, really enjoyed the experience. It was a lot of fun. Congrats to Willie Azza for the win. Definitely a very, very strong deck that was built. And yeah, had a lot of fun. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.